It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. It's a slight gear change for me. The last couple of days I was in Salt Lake City, speaking first of all to faculty at Brigham Young University and then at a Mormon family conference yesterday. So it's nice to be able to get a cup of coffee before I speak. Anyway, I want to talk today about the importance of creeds and confessions. Should put a couple of background disclaimers up before we start. First of all, I'm certainly not in these lectures going to be advocating something that guarantees the church will never fall away, or guarantee, well, I should probably qualify that guarantees that no denomination or congregation will ever fall away. One of the common objections to creeds and confessions is, well, look at the history of creedal and confessional churches. They tend to fall away. Well, that's true, but that doesn't necessarily mean the creeds and confessions are the thing that make them fall away, if I could put it that way. For a church to remain faithful, I think you need faithful leadership and a solid doctrinal foundation. And unless you have them both, then there's always going to be a vulnerability. So please don't read my lectures as saying, Trueman saying this is the silver bullet that prevents churches from going wrong. Clearly, history indicates that the mere possession of a creed or confession does not prevent churches from going astray. One might also add to that the mere possession of the Bible doesn't guarantee that churches will remain faithful either. It's a question of what is the best way, what is practically the best way to achieve the ends that the Bible, or God through the Bible, calls on the church to achieve. Secondly, and this was very much lies in the background of the book. One of the reasons I wrote the book was I wrote the book to try to persuade what I would describe as good evangelical brothers and sisters that confessions are a good thing. So the book was not really a polemical book. One of the things that I tried to do in the book is to argue that the very things that evangelical brothers and sisters value most highly and wish to protect most fiercely are best protected by the use of creeds and confessions. So if you're here today and you're not a creedal person, you're not from a creedal or confessional church, please don't hear what I'm saying as polemical. My approach in this is very much to try to argue that the very things that you value, maybe the very things that make you worry about creeds and confessions for good reasons, are actually the things that are best protected by a judicious use of creeds and confessions. So that's some background then. Let's start. In this first lecture, I want to talk about why it is that creeds and confessions would prove unpopular today. And one of the things that I would argue as a church historian is that the idea that the church has no creed but the Bible, or no creed but Christ, no book but the Bible, that's a relatively new innovation, actually. That historically that has not been the position of the church. It was not actually the position of the church, certainly in the 2nd century. And I would argue it was not the position of the church in the New Testament either, for reasons that we'll come to. Which raises the question of why is it that we tend to conceive of biblical authority today in a way that has no room, or often has no room, or very limited room, for the notion of creeds and confessions. And I want to suggest that some of the reasons driving that are actually worldly reasons. Certainly many evangelical brothers and sisters would want to argue that they believe what they do about the Bible, and they believe what they do about the need to reject creeds and confessions on the basis of the Bible. What I would want to suggest at this point, however, is that may not be quite as simple. That may not be quite as simple and clear-cut as people tend to think. That in actual fact, it could be that some of what I call the pathologies, just the habits or the intuitions of the culture and the world in which we live, have actually shaped our understanding of creeds and confessions in a negative way. And I want to suggest that if you're going to argue that creeds and confessions are a good thing, you're automatically buying into 3 important assumptions And each of these assumptions, I think, can be justified from the Bible. And if they can each be justified from the Bible, then there is no good reason why Christians should not accept the legitimacy and the usefulness of creeds and confessions. And the three assumptions are these. First, the past is important and has things of positive relevance to teach us. That we have, if you like, a certain view of history, that it is something that can be a source of wisdom and help. Not that everything historically is so, but that there is nothing in principle wrong with thinking that history can teach us something in the present. Secondly, the second assumption is this: language must be an appropriate vehicle for the stable transmission of truth across time and geographical space. It's a slight mouthful, but let me repeat it. Language must be an appropriate vehicle for the stable transmission of truth across time and geographical space. And thirdly, there must be a body or an institution which can authoritatively compose and enforce creeds and confessions. Just as an aside, one of the things that I am assuming in many ways about creeds and confessions is we can't write them for ourselves. I can't produce a Trueman confession. Churches produce confessions. Churches produce creeds. They are ecclesiastical documents. And that, I think, imposes a certain authority on them. Not an unquestionable authority. I'm neither Eastern Orthodox nor Roman Catholic. I don't think that just because the church has made Declaration X must be true. But I do think that if church makes Declaration X, I as an individual find that the burden of proof lies with me to demonstrate that the church is wrong there. That, if you like, the default position should be that the church is correct. And that's actually the position of the Reformers. When you look at the Reformers, when you look at what they do, the Reformers by and large assume that the church has got it right, and they only reject those bits of the tradition that they think ultimately cannot in any way, shape or form be justified on the basis of Scripture. The last thing Calvin wanted to be in Geneva in the 16th century was an original theologian. Originality is a virtue only in the modern world. It was not a virtue in the 16th century. My good friend Richard Muller used to teach at Calvin Theological Seminary, probably done more than anybody else to revise and revitalize the study of 17th century Reformed theology. Richard Muller used to quip that there was only one original theologian in Geneva in the 16th century. And they burned him because of his originality. Michael Servetus. You don't want to be original. So there must be a body or an institution which can authoritatively compose and enforce creeds and confessions. What's interesting, of course, is that every one of those assumptions, the past is important, language as stable means of communicating reality and truth, and institutional authority are under huge attack in the modern world. And I might almost add, and this is not I think I have my patriotic Union Jack socks on this morning for no apparent reason other than they were the ones that I pulled out the suitcase. I'm not saying this to get at Americans at all. If I'm getting at Americans, I'll let you know. This is not to get at Americans, but certainly the past is important. And the idea of institutional authority, these are very counterintuitive to American culture. That's the instinctive way a lot of Americans think. Rugged individualism and forward-looking progress. Those are big parts of the American dream. And they're just cultural. They're not necessarily biblical. They could just be cultural. And I think it behooves us all, before we reject creeds and confessions, to subject our thinking to some level of criticism on these points. The challenges, and this actually, there's an odd connection. By the way, it's a great delight to be talking about creeds and confessions today. I've spent the last 8 months talking about transgenderism, as I was yesterday in Provo, Utah. But there are some interesting, potent similarities, actually, between this talk and some of the things I'll be saying tomorrow when I address identity issues and LGBTQ stuff. And the similarities derive out of the fact that the same culture that has made LGBTQ stuff plausible is the same culture that tilts us away from institutional authority, thinking the past is important, and trusting language. It's all, in some ways, part and parcel of one big, what I would describe as one big cultural mess, or bit of anarchy, if you like. So I want to talk about the forces that lie behind these assumptions. The way, if you like, they tilt our intuitions in ways we're not even aware of towards dissing the past, distrusting language, distrusting institutions. First is science. We live in a very scientifically oriented world. Many years ago, 1996, was my first time I was ever in the United States. I was a visiting professor at Calvin College in Michigan, Grand Rapids in Michigan. And Saturday night, my wife and I, it was always tense time in the house because there was a clash of programs on the TV. There was Walker, Texas Ranger on the one hand, and there was Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman on the other. No movie with Chuck Norris in can be all bad, as far as I'm concerned. If Chuck's there, it's got to be useful or good at some level. But, for all the fact that I believe in sort of male headship in marriage, I consistently lost that argument, and we tended to watch Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. What was interesting about Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman is it was a beautiful reflection of modern cultural priorities. In that the minister in this village, it's set in the 19th century, I think. The minister in the village or in the town, he's a very nice fellow, but he's a real buffoon. He's a real buffoon. And Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, played by the beautiful English actress Jane Seymour, she's the local doctor. But what's interesting is she doesn't just cure bodies, she also cures souls. She's the source of wisdom as well. And that struck me as an interesting cultural reflection of our priorities. That the scientific person, if you like, is not just good for science, but is also seen as virtuous and wise. And that's reflective, I think, of priorities in our world, that science is something that we all, and in some ways rightly, hold in high regard. Science has done many great things. Who wants to live in a world before penicillin, for example? I think it was Calvin Coolidge's son. I think God blistered his foot playing tennis and died of septicemia. That would have been in the 1920s. We don't want to live in a world, or I don't want to live in a world, where if I scratch myself on a rusty nail, I stand a chance of dying. Science has delivered big time. We put a lot of authority in science, but think of what it does culturally to our minds. It tilts us towards thinking that the future is always going to be better than the past. It does other things as well that I'll talk about tomorrow. But one of the things is it tilts us towards the future. The past tends to be, at best, just a prequel to the present, which is in turn really just an inferior version of what's just down the line. That tilts us away from thinking of the past as authoritative. It connects very much to technology. Again, technology has done what? Well, I'd say technology has, to a large extent, led to improving our lives. Students sometimes say to me, I teach history classes, and they'll say, you're a historian, what age would you like to have lived in? To which my answer is, are you kidding? I'm a historian. I want to live in this age, or maybe 10 years down the line. I don't want to live in a world with no flush toilets, no antibiotics, Black Plague, those kind of things. COVID, as bad as it's been. Nothing like the Black Plague. Amused might be the wrong word, but when people were circulating the Luther text about what to do in a time of plague, part of me wanted to say, well, actually, the one thing where this breaks down is it's not really a plague. When you think that in Europe, 30 to 35% of the population was wiped out by the Black Plague, and not even the most catastrophic estimates, which thankfully have not come true, not even the most catastrophic estimates about COVID ever put it at 35%. Of the world's population being wiped out. I don't want to live in a world like that. Technology, again, also points us to the future, and also, I would suggest, creates an idea of present wisdom. I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow because I think it plays in a big way into LGBTQ kind of culture. But technology gives us the idea that we are greater today because we have a greater mastery over things than they had in the past. And again, there's some truth to that. There is some truth to that. The problem is it tilts our general cultural instincts in a particular direction. And I would suggest tilts them in a direction that is not entirely helpful in some particular areas. Consumerism. Again, we tend to think of consumerism, we often think of it, certainly in Christian circles, that the primary problem is it sort of plays to greed. It creates an acquisitive understanding of what it means to be a human being. I think consumerism also does something else. It tilts us away from the past and towards the future. Because what consumerism is saying to you is, your life now is inferior. Buy this good. Purchase this service, and your future life will be improved. Your image will be improved. Consumerism sells a kind of desire for the future, we might say, that tilts us away from the past. It tilts us towards the future. We might also add, and again I'm going to touch on this a little bit tomorrow, but from a slightly different angle, youth culture. Think about youth culture. I remember some years ago when there were debates about healthcare in America, and Justin Bieber was being interviewed about his views on healthcare. I think he was like 15 at the time. And I was thinking, wherever you come down on the healthcare debate, hopefully we can all agree that Justin Bieber will not make a helpful contribution to the debate, one way or the other, because he's like 15, and 15-year-old kids are ignorant. But if you live in a world where youth has been exalted, where what really goes on as you grow up is you become corrupted, and therefore the wisest people on the face of the planet are the least corrupted, in other words, the youngest, then think about how that tilts your attitude towards the past. The past becomes little more than a story of corruption. Corruption. And isn't that often how we tell the story? Or some people tell the story of the rise of creeds and confessions. That in the book of Acts, we have this pristine church. Everybody agrees on the gospel. The young church is the wise church. And it gets slowly but surely corrupted over time. That narrative is perhaps most powerful in sort of Anabaptist kind of circles. But think about the general cult of youth. It's also, of course, fueled by consumerism. Nobody sells goods on the basis of buy this good and you'll look 25 years older. Buy this outfit and you'll look just like your dad. That is not a kind of a sales pitch. But think about what that does in terms of its general cultural intuitions. It's meaning it tilts us against the past. And we could add to that, the whole, just look at what's gone on in the summer of 2020. An explosion against the past in many ways. I live in Slippery Rock in northwestern Pennsylvania. It's a very poor. I live in comparative affluence, but I live in a beautiful house. But 3/4 of a mile from my door, there is a trailer park where the kids have to go to the local high school to get showers because there's no running hot and cold water. I live in the center of, it's Trump territory. I saw one rainbow flag during Pride Month within a sort of 25-mile radius. I saw one Biden banner during the election campaign. It's hardcore Trump territory. What's interested me about some of the Trump voters is that when Sanders dropped out of the race, they switched to Trump. That was interesting to me. What do they have in common? Well, the extremes of both parties, we might say, have a kind of burn it to the ground kind of feel about them, a sort of anti-historical feel. We live in an era where we see the old institutions as having failed. And that tilts us away from thinking of the past as a good thing and seeing it as a failed experiment. and putting all of our hopes in the future. How does this play into creeds and confessions? Well, this is our general, I'm going to use this term tomorrow when I give the talks on the LGB stuff. It plays into what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls our social imaginary. It's a rather obscure term, but what Taylor means by that is it fits in the way we intuitively imagine the world to be. We're not conscious of these tendencies in our thinking. We just naturally tilt that way. So I want to suggest that first point, the anti-historical tendency, that might be alive and well in Christian circles because it's the air we breathe. Second point, and this sort of plays into the idea of language must be an appropriate vehicle for stable transmission of truth across time and geographical space. The disappearance of human nature. You know, well, how do you get there? Well, I think, think about it. We're aware that human beings do change somewhat over time. You know, if you'd been born in the Middle Ages, you would think somewhat differently about the world than you do today. If you were born in ancient Athens, you'd have thought somewhat differently about the way you'd have thought about the world if you're a medieval peasant or if you're a 21st century American. Think about the way we think about the world today. It's very interesting to me how diversity has exploded. When I first arrived in the United States, it's interesting what words drop out of common usage. There was a weird word. Robert, you can probably testify to this, of which there is no equivalent in Britain. Britain, of course, is an American construct. We're all either Welsh, English, Irish, Ulsterman, or Scottish. Last and least, I have to say, the Scots. No, actually, the Welsh are last and least, it has to be said. Un-American. I'd hear that a lot on the news, certainly in the 90s when I was in Grand Rapids and then when we emigrated in 2001. You'd hear about things being un-American. And there's no British equivalent. To say, well, that's very un-English sounds like an ironic statement. You know, it's if somebody's drunk tea at 3:30 rather than 4 or something like that. But the existence of the term un-American was interesting because it implied there was some kind of coherent concept of what it meant to be an American that was the foundation for everything else. So you could be an Italian American, or you could be a Polish American, you could be an Irish American. And there were these sort of diverse distinctives that those pointed to, but the bottom line was, you're an American. And that sort of brought unity to everything. It's interesting that the term un-American has really dropped out of, certainly out of the news media, even out of conversations as I've had them the last 5 or 10 years. And what has replaced it, of course, is this massive emphasis on diversity, which can be constructed in various ways. But what's interesting is diversity, when diversity is accented at the expense of everything else, what's really going on is that the points of unity are disappearing. And on one level, you know, America, it is a historical construct. It didn't exist as a sort of an entity 600 years ago. You know, the landmass did. But America, the nation, did not exist 600 years ago. So, you know, things come and things go in history. The danger, of course, is when the emphasis on diversity undermines human nature. Human nature has, you know, it takes different forms throughout history. But there's still some kind of core thing binding it together. I always think of 1 Corinthians is interesting. That's Paul's great statement on diversity, I think, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where he says, okay, if you're Jewish, you're going to reject the cross for this reason. If you're Greek, you're going to reject it for that reason. You're both wrong. Cultural diversity will explain why you are wrong in these distinctive ways. But you're both going to be held to account by the same cross. And if you believe the cross, then you believe it's the power of God to salvation, and that's what's going to unite you. I think that what we've witnessed intellectually over the last 200 years and culturally, dramatically over the last 15, 20, 25 years, is the collapse of confidence in the notion of human nature. Now, think about what that does to creeds and confessions. You might be saying there, I came to hear about creeds and confessions, not about human nature. Why is it that I subscribe to the Westminster Standards, the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms? Well, there might be various reasons for that, but one of the assumptions behind that is that there is enough that binds me together with a bunch of dead white guys in the middle of the 17th century that I can affirm what they say as being useful and valuable today. And that assumes some commonality of human nature. Yeah, actually, I think it also assumes a common horizon of biblical revelation as well. You've got a common human nature engaging a common horizon of biblical revelation. Once you start to lose confidence that human nature is strong enough to give us that bond with other human beings, and you combine that with an increasing lack of confidence or even opposition to history, creedalism and confessionalism cease to make sense. They start to look like arbitrary ways of abusing power in the present. That's what's happened. And I think one even gets that in conservative circles. Well, okay, I know the Westminster Confession was good then, and I know it's good for white people in the United States of America in the 21st century. But what about this diverse group or that diverse group? Now, don't hear me wrong. I'm not here saying that there's nothing that Westminster Confession Presbyterians cannot learn from other groups. But the bedrock for me is it doesn't matter that that document was written by dead white guys in the middle of the 17th century. It was actually written by human beings in the middle of the 17th century. And while that may mean, that may not mean that it is automatically relevant and applicable today, I cannot dismiss it purely on chronological or ethnic grounds. So, the disappearance of human nature plays into this anti-creedalism as well. Other things. The notion that language is manipulative. That's very deep set in our society. There's a wonderful essay. It's written by a Roman Catholic philosopher, Joseph Pieper. It's called Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. I reread it just last week in sort of preparation for this, making the key point there that as soon as we stop thinking that language actually attaches to reality in some way, language simply becomes a means of abusing power. Most of our politicians provide us with great examples of that on a daily basis. Language for politicians is by and large not a way of speaking the truth, it's a way of winning votes. It's a manipulative thing. And I think we have a lot of reason to be very suspicious of language. The history of Europe in the 20th century, bloodiest century in Europe's history, could be told from the perspective of political propaganda and abuse of language. So we have a lot of reason for believing that language can be manipulative. And again, I think when that's part of the way you intuit the world to be, it profoundly shapes how you will think about creeds and confessions. They become not guides to reality, but means of wielding power. Means of winning disciples, not to the Lord, but to your cause and to your denomination. And as I say, we have to put our hands up at this point and say, there's an awful lot of truth to that. But just because language can be abused doesn't mean that language is always inherently abusive, if I could put it that way. People are murdered every day in the United States with bullets, but it doesn't mean that there aren't legitimate uses to which bullets can be put. I live in Western Pennsylvania. More armed men in the woods of Western Pennsylvania in hunting season than in the whole of Western Europe in their armed forces, I'm sure. And I think I might be the only unarmed man within a 100-mile radius. I love that line in, I think it's John le Carre's The Night Manager, when the American CIA agent and the British MI5 agent are engaged, and it suddenly emerges that the British agent doesn't have a gun. And the American says to her, "What do you do when you're in trouble?" And she says, "I call for help." So anyway, that's just an aside. Mysticism. Mysticism is also a powerful force. The Madonna song, Bedtime Stories, captures this. Words are useless, she sings, especially sentences. They don't stand for anything. How could they explain how I feel? The powerful emphasis we place on emotions today and feelings, and what I would call aesthetics, tilts us away from taking language and words seriously. I was talking to the Latter-day Saints yesterday. I was talking to them, listen to how your kids talk about morality. By and large, your kids will not be using the language of right or wrong. They'll be using the language of taste. That's offensive. That's distasteful. That's hurtful. That's an interesting shift. That's an interesting shift. And if we're honest, we can all tend to use that kind of language. Think what it's doing. It's actually weakening the power of language and making its significance that of subjective emotional response rather than statement of affairs or statement of right, wrong, or truth. Anti-authoritarianism. Hardly need to us. And I would say anti-authoritarianism, that is universal in society. It affects the right politically as much as it affects the left. I live in, as I say, Western Pennsylvania. It's a very kind of libertarian area in many ways. My wife and I were laughing the other week. They did some roundup in Pittsburgh, which is the one non-Western Pennsylvania area in Western Pennsylvania. The police were rounding up kids who were out on the road, 12, 13-year-old kids riding dirt bikes and ATVs along the highways in Pittsburgh. I cycle. Every day I'm overtaken by some 12-year-old kid driving a tractor or an ATV or a dirt bike on the road in Western Pennsylvania. It's bandit country. People have said, how did you handle the mask mandates, etc. in Western Pennsylvania? It was sort of, mask mandates? What were they kind of thing? It's very anti-authoritarian. Hardcore Trump territory, but very anti-authoritarian. Very anti-authoritarian. This is not the monopoly of any particular branch. The liberals, the progressives, the conservatives, etc., etc. We all have a fear of authority and institutions. And again, I think, like our concerns about language, there's some good reason for that. Authority has and is regularly abused. Institutions have failed. Institutions have used their authority to do great harm and to hurt people. But it doesn't necessarily mean that institutions in and of themselves have to be inherently corrupt. But again, if every time on the news all you hear about is the wickedness of the media or the wickedness of this institution or that institution, it's going to tilt the way you think about the world away from anything that smacks of hierarchy or authority. It's going to fuel your desire for independence. And that, I think, again, how does that affect creeds and confessions? Well, think of that third point. Creeds and confessions, if you don't think that institutions have the right to formulate and require these things of their membership, because you're anti-authoritarian, you're not going to have any place for creeds or confessions. One of the things and this statement is often made in a very sincere way, but I think it's misguided. You often hear people say, I don't have a creed or confession. I just believe the Bible. To which the answer is, no, that's not true. Nobody just believes the Bible. Everybody believes the Bible means something. If I ask you, well, what do you think the Bible means? You're not just going to start reading the Bible in Genesis 1 and end at Revelation 22. You're going to synthesize the content of the Bible and say, well, this is what it means and this is how to read it. That's your creed. What you're actually doing when you say I have no creed is what you're saying is, I do have a creed, but I don't intend to write it down because I'm not going to be answerable to my creed to anybody else. You're essentially saying, my reading of the Bible is the correct one, but I'm not going to tell you what it is because you have no authority to correct it. Flows out of that anti-authoritarian mindset. And then finally, and this is all the bad news, by the way, in this first lecture. The last point, I think, is fear of exclusion. And that may not be something that afflicts pastors so much, but it is something that will affect our congregants. Creeds and confessions, by their very definition, say, if you don't believe this, then you don't belong. If you don't believe this, you don't belong. And that's exclusive. And that's, I say, a lot of pastors, I don't find this a particular problem with pastors a lot of the time, but it will certainly affect members of your congregation. Anybody who's ever engaged in church discipline in their church will know that however just the disciplinary cause is, nobody will thank you for it. Because as soon as you bring a charge against somebody, they become a victim and you're trying to exclude them. And all of the gravity in modern society pulls against that idea. So the fear of exclusion, I think, also concerns us about the creeds and confessions. Great thing about minimum confession, the 6-point statement of faith is you can include so many people because you actually require so little of them in order to be members serving in your church. So that fear of exclusion also plays into this then. So when we think about those three assumptions, the past is important and has things of positive relevance to teach us. Language must be an appropriate vehicle for stable transmission of the truth across time and geographical space. And there must be a body or institution which can authoritatively compose and enforce creeds and confessions. All three of them are very countercultural today. And all of us in this room, and even more so congregants, will be susceptible to being influenced by those cultural forces. On the other hand, if you accept those three assumptions, as I'm going to argue in the second lecture, then there's no real reason why you shouldn't accept creeds and confessions as being a good and appropriate thing for the church. So that's where we're going to go in the second lecture. I think we have a 15-minute break now, and there's some lovely refreshments by the looks of it being provided at the back.